Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are jumping into some really fascinating sociological research.
We are. It tackles a question that's fundamental, really, especially in the modern world. How do people figure out who they are, their identity, particularly when they're living in a, let's say, complex political and religious setting?
And that setting for this study is Iran. So, our mission for you, the listener, is to help extract the core insights from this major sociological study. It looked right into the heart of identity formation, hoviyat, I believe is the term, among Iranians. And it paid really close attention to the role religion plays.
That's right, Hoviat. And when we talk about identity here, it's important to understand it's not just, simple self-awareness. The researchers frame identity formation as this multi-layered process and needs two key actions. First, recognizing yourself, obviously. But second, and this is crucial, actively distinguishing yourself from others. They call this differentiation.
Differentiation, right. And that specific term they use is tamayyoz yaftegi.
Exactly. Tamayyoz yaftegi. This capacity for differentiation, it's basically the yardstick they used for individual identity in this research. It's the mechanism that lets someone say, okay, I belong to this group, but this is my unique place within it. It's a really tricky balancing act.
Sounds like it. And to measure something that nuanced, you need solid data. How did they go about collecting it?
Oh, they gathered a lot of data. They used a large-scale survey method, a paymage. And they didn't just stick to one place. They went across 7 major provincial centers. So Tehran was in there, Kurdistan, East Azerbaijan, quite a spread.
So this wasn't just a small local snapshot then?
Not at all. They talked to 1,300 participants, everyone over 16 years old. And they used multistage, systematic random sampling to try and get a representative picture, something approaching a national view.
Okay. A serious effort then, mapping how all these internal feelings and external pressures shape how people see themselves across a pretty diverse country.
Definitely. They were really trying to get at the underlying forces.
All right, let's dive into the findings. If you had to boil down the main conclusion, just one sentence specifically about the religious dimension, what would that be?
Okay, the core finding is this. Religion holds a centrally important, really unique, but also non-exclusive place in the individual identity of Iranians. And, maybe counterintuitively, it actually contributes directly to individual differentiation.
Wait, hold on. That feels like a contradiction right off the bat. Usually we think of religion as a unifier, right? The thing that builds the collective we. How can something that binds people together also be a key driver of, well, setting individuals apart?
That's the fascinating tension the research uncovered, this powerful dual functionality. So on one hand, yes, religion acts as a major factor promoting individual differentiation. It helps define your unique path, your personal understanding or relationship with faith. It marks you as distinct. But at the exact same time, it helps construct that collective we, the jamima. It does this by providing a shared framework, common beliefs, maybe shared practices, which inevitably reduces some individual differences for the sake of group belonging.
Ah, I see. So it's like it draws the unique outline of the individual, but it also draws the boundary around the community they belong to, defines the I and the U.S.
You've got it. It allows for that individuality, but within a structure that's shared. That's why it's so potent.
Now, let's put this in perspective. Religion is central, you said, but how central compared to other things that make up someone's identity? Where did it rank?
Good question.
Yeah.
The researchers looked at 13 different components of identity in total. Things ranging from, say, connection to territory all the way to communication styles. The religious dimension, the dini boad, it was important, yes, but it came in 8th overall based on the average agreement scores.
8th. Okay, so what ranked higher? That tells us a lot about the cultural bedrock, doesn't it?
It really does. The top 3 were,
Yes.
first, territorial or ethnic scope, basically, where you're from, your group. Second, a tendency toward perfection, this personal drive. And third, the importance of traditional values.
Wow, okay. That definitely reframes things. So while religion is clearly crucial, maybe the most powerful immediate identifiers are still things like your region, your ethnic group, those inherited cultural values, and maybe even just personal ambition. Religion is a constant presence, but it exists alongside these other really powerful cultural and personal forces.
Think of it maybe like this. Those other top factors, territory, tradition, perfectionism, they provide the deep cultural soil, maybe the landscape.
Right.
And religion, it's like this intricate network of roots spreading through that soil. Both are absolutely vital for the individual, for the person to stand tall.
That's a helpful analogy. Okay, let's drill down into the demographics now. We need to understand if this complex identity picture changes depending on who you are. Let's start with the standard variables, gender and age, or generation. Did the data show this religious dimension holding steady, or did it fragment?
Well, this is where things get really interesting, actually, because of the lack of difference. The sheer uniformity was quite striking. When they looked specifically at the strength of that religious dimension and identity, the results were remarkably similar across both gender and age groups.
Let's start with gender. I might have guessed, perhaps based on societal roles, that women might express their religious identity differently, maybe more strongly. Was that borne out by the data?
Intuitively, you might think that, and numerically, there was a tiny difference. Men had a slightly higher mean score, 25.66 compared to 24.31 for women. But, and this is the important part, when they ran the statistical analysis, that difference wasn't significant. P was greater than 0.05.
So statistically speaking, negligible.
Exactly. Accounting for the margin of error, the influence of this religious dimension on how people form their identity showed no measurable difference between men and women. It seems to be an almost identical factor, regardless of gender.
Okay, that's surprising. What about age? Did you see a generational gap? Youth growing up with social media, maybe seeing things differently from older adults?
Again, remarkable stability. There was a slight trend, a gradient, you could say. Adults and elders had the highest mean score at 26.46, then the intermediate generation at 25.28, and youth were lowest at 23.90. But crucially, that difference, that gradient, it wasn't large enough to be statistically significant either. The p-value was 0.117.
So the big insight here is that this religious part of identity is just so deeply woven into the social fabric that its statistical impact, its prevalence, is basically foundational and widespread across these major demographic lines. Gender, generation, it's a constant.
That seems to be the major takeaway on those variables, yes. A stable foundational element. Now, here's where the data did show clear, statistically significant fragmentation. Ethnicity. This is where things got really interesting.
Okay. So the religious component did vary significantly depending on which specific ethnic group people belong to?
Absolutely. This was the demographic variable that really stood out. The analysis and ANOVI test showed a significant difference with an F-value of 6.868 and a p-value less than 0.05. And the groups showing the highest mean scores for this religious dimension were the Kurds at 29.79 and the Turks at 27.57.
Highest scores for Kurds and Turks. And who scored the lowest?
The lowest mean scores were found among Arabs at 20.33 and the Fars at 22.69. And digging a bit deeper, the post hoc tests showed the difference in this religious identity dimension between Kurds and Fars was statistically significant.
But not between Fars and, say, other groups like Lurs or Gilaks.
Correct. The significant difference highlighted was specifically between Kurds and Fars in this context.
That suggests maybe a dynamic where, for certain groups, perhaps minority groups or those in specific regions like the Kurds, religion plays an even stronger, more emphasized role in defining their individual uniqueness and maybe their community structure compared to the Fars, who are often seen as the dominant or central cultural group. It becomes a more pointed marker of selfhood, perhaps.
That's a very plausible interpretation of the finding. Yes, the context of being part of a distinct ethnic group, especially one with a unique history or position within the nation, could certainly sharpen the lines of all identity markers, including the religious one.
Makes sense. Now, the study also looked at something very contemporary, the digital world, specifically social media use. Did jumping into that virtual space affect this religious dimension of identity?
They did look at that. They compared users and non-users of social media, or what they term virtual space, Majazi Faza. They found that non-users actually had a slightly higher mean score for the religious dimension, 25.66, compared to users at 24.31.
Okay, slightly higher for non-users. Was that difference statistically significant, though?
No, not at the time of the study. The difference wasn't large enough to be statistically significant.
I sense a but coming.
Well, the authors made a really important observation looking ahead. They suggested that even though it wasn't significant then, this divide between users and non-users of virtual space is likely to create more pronounced identity differences over time. Their hypothesis is that as this Magazi Faza becomes more and more ingrained in daily life, it will probably accelerate the individualization of belief and religious practice.
Right, because you can curate your own sources, your own interpretations outside of traditional structures.
Exactly, which sets the stage perfectly for the final, maybe most complex part of the research, the mechanics of how this all works.
It's not just enough to know the rankings or the demographic differences. We need to understand the process, right? How do all these forces, nation, ethnicity, religion, media, actually interact to build that differentiated identity?
Precisely. And the study modeled this using two main interactive cycles or loops. This is where the sociological analysis really tried to map the dynamics. They proposed that these external factors channel their influence onto that core identity process, individual differentiation through these two interconnected pathways.
Okay, let's take them one by one. Cycle 1 you called the social macro loop. This sounds like the more established, traditional, maybe political dynamics.
That's a good way to put it, yes. This cycle focuses on how three big dimensions interact: national identity, Meli; religious identity, Dini; and ethnic identity, Gomi. Think of it like a sequence. First, the national dimension, things like government policy, shared history taught in schools, national symbols, influences, and shapes the context for the religious dimension.
Okay, so the state or the national narrative sets certain boundaries or expectations around religion.
It influences the environment, yes. Then, that contextualized religious dimension interacts directly with the ethnic dimension. Now, here's the crucial push-pull within this cycle. Both the national dimension and the religious dimension, according to the model, tend to cause an increase in individual differentiation. They encourage a unique loyalty to the nation or a personal relationship with faith.
Right, defining your individual stance. So what's the counterforce in this loop?
The ethnic dimension, in this model, generally acts as the stabilizer, the force for cohesion. It works to solidify the collective we by reducing differentiation. It pushes for group conformity, shared language, shared customs, that sense of belonging.
So you have nation and religion kind of pushing you to be individually distinct within those frameworks, while your ethnicity is pulling you back towards group sameness, towards cohesion.
That's the tension, exactly. It explains the constant negotiation many people feel, I think, between wanting to be unique and needing to belong to their immediate community. It's like an engine of tension built right into how identity works in this context.
Fascinating. Okay, now let's look at cycle 2, the modern media loop. This must be where things like that virtual space discussion come in. This feels like the dynamic that's actively reshaping things right now.
It absolutely is. This loop describes how virtual space, Majazi Faza, and mass media, Jami Razana, impact that whole identity structure. The key difference now is that digital media isn't just broadcasting one message to everyone. It allows for incredibly personalized consumption and even creation of religious thought and practice.
Right, so instead of maybe only getting religious understanding from, say, the local cleric or established institutions, you can now curate your own feed, find niche interpretations, connect with like-minded people globally.
Precisely that. So this virtual space and the broader mass media landscape significantly influence the religious dimension itself, changing its texture. Then, this altered, perhaps more individualized, modern religious context interacts with the ethnic dimension, similar to the first cycle.
And what's the overall effect on differentiation when this digital influence is added to the mix?
The model suggests that active participation in this virtual context leads to a further significant increase in individual differentiation, specifically mediated through that changing religious dimension and the influence of mass media.
So the digital world is essentially turbocharging the individualizing aspect of religion, making it even more of a factor that sets people apart, rather than just binding them together.
That seems to be the direction indicated by the model, yes. It potentially makes the religious dimension even more of a driver of individuality.
Wow. This research really does challenge some common assumptions, doesn't it? We often think of religion, especially in a place like Iran, as primarily a source of collective identity, maybe even static. But this study paints a picture of it as this incredibly dynamic catalyst for personal uniqueness, constantly being shaped and reshaped by national identity, ethnic belonging, and now, very powerfully, by digital life.
That's the key takeaway, I think. Identity isn't presented here as some fixed statue. It's a powerful, ongoing process, an engine, as we said. It simultaneously drives that deep human need for individual uniqueness and the equally deep need for group belonging. And it's constantly adjusting based on these external pressures and internal negotiations.
That complexity definitely leaves you with a lot to think about. So, based on everything we've discussed, what's the final provocative thought we should leave the listener with? What's the core tension they can mull over?
Okay, consider this potential long-term collision course that seems embedded in these cycles. We saw the ethnic dimension generally working to reduce differentiation,
Right.
to build and maintain that strong collective we.
Right. Cohesive force.
But conversely, The religious dimension, especially amplified by digital media and virtual spaces, seems to be pushing more and more towards increasing individual differentiation. It encourages personalized faith, unique interpretations. So, the question to ponder is, if these virtual spaces keep changing how people experience, understand, and practice their faith, making it increasingly a matter of personal choice and curation, what's the long-term impact on that collective identity, the we, that's traditionally been so strongly anchored in ethnic ties? Will this rise of digital religious individuality potentially weaken the cohesion of the ethnic group? Or, perhaps, could the pressure of all this differentiation actually force the emergence of entirely new forms of collective identity? That tension between religious individuality and ethnic cohesion in the digital age, that's something to watch.
A really powerful question to end on. Thank you for unpacking that complex study with us.
My pleasure. It's fascinating material.